Seconds. Here comes Mitchell. Go Bear! Utah takes the lead. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Basketball in the Mountains. This is episode 19, and we are back talking NBA today, but we are not talking about the Nuggets because I'm recording this on Thursday, about 6 hours before Game 6 between the Nuggets and Thunder tip-off. So most of you will probably know the outcome of that game by the time you listen to this. But you have a lot to talk about today after the draft lottery. We are going to be talking about the Utah Jazz falling to number 5 despite having the worst record in the league, and just kind of where Utah goes from here after a disappointing night, and just kind of sets the tone for an interesting offseason, I feel like, in Salt Lake City. So to do so, we have a great guest today in Ben Anderson from KSL. He is the Utah Jazz insider for KSL. Ben, thanks for coming on and joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right. Well, I wanted to start off with kind of the initial reaction for yourself and the fan base, because it felt like it was trending. Obviously, this was the most likely outcome for the Jazz not getting a top 4 pick. But was it just kind of shock, or did you feel like the fans were maybe expecting this at some point after maybe in the build up to the lottery?
No, I mean, I certainly was following the odds, and they had a 48% chance of falling to 5. So I wasn't necessarily stunned by it, but I do think the fans were surprised and maybe almost felt like they were owed a better pick than this after, I guess ethically tanking the last 2 years, where they really didn't do what they did this past season, which was just win 17 games, be the worst team in the NBA. The Jazz kind of tried to do both. They tried to be competitive through the first half of the season in 2022-23, and then again in 2023-24. And then hoped, okay, maybe you can be the number 9 or 10 team that jumps up the way we've seen the Hawks and now the Mavericks and the Spurs do in the last couple of years. And they didn't. They had the worst case scenario. So, not only did they not get Cooper Flagg or Dylan Harper, they're kind of left with, who else is on the board at number 5. So I think fans felt a little robbed by that.
Yeah, I think this is the worst season in terms of wins in franchise history. Like you said, it was the last couple of years. The Jazz, was a franchise people were feeling really good about. You had Lauri Markkanen's Most Improved Player of the Year award during that season, where they were kind of overachieving and then kind of tanked at the end. Same thing last year. But this year was a very clear objective from the start. And I remember watching the Jazz maybe in November when they were in Denver, just going to check out Cody Williams, a guy who I covered here in Colorado, and just it did not seem like it was going to be one of those kinds of seasons. It felt like the Jazz had really committed to trying to get Cooper Flagg, because it felt like, just with the way the roster and that has been built the last couple of years, that they were the one thing the Jazz are missing is maybe that North Star, if you will, of a guy who makes everything else fit a little bit better and puts everybody else in a slightly smaller role. But now the Jazz obviously are going to have the highest pick they've had since they got Dante Exum at number 5 in 2014. There are a bunch of different guys to look at here. Who are the early guys maybe that are standing out for you? Because obviously it feels like Cooper Flagg's going to go 1, and Dylan Harper seems like at this point is going to go number 2. Makes sense. And it feels like anything else is kind of on the table for Utah at this point.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what, Jazz fans will come around to is that whoever, had they gotten the 3rd pick, some of those names that are there at 3 are still going to be there at 5. I mean, I think there's still a chance that Ace Bailey is on the board at 5. Mm-hmm. Maybe a little bit less VJ Edgecombe. He just seems like a really natural fit for what the Charlotte Hornets are going to do. But the Charlotte Hornets have new ownership and a new front office and don't always make sound decisions. So you never know what direction they're going to go in. So, I mean, there's a chance both of those guys are on the board, in all honesty, at number 5. And then I think the Jazz would feel like, okay, well, it's not as good as winning number 3 overall, but actually, in a way, there's some upside there because A, it's the same guys on the board, and B, you're paying them a little bit less. So those are 2 names that Jazz fans will still have to get themselves familiar with, even if it's a little bit of a pipe dream. And then I think the other 2 most commonly have been Kon Knueppel and Tre Johnson. I know a lot of people locally like both of those guys. Their positional needs, they bring shooting to the Jazz, who were, I think they took the 6th most threes in the NBA last year and had the 9th worst percentage in the NBA. So Will Hardy's system likes to shoot the ball. They like to get the shots up, but they were not going in at a high enough rate last year.
Yeah, VJ Edgecombe is a guy who I feel like probably is the only other guy that might not make it to 5, just because seems like that's a guy that Daryl Morey would go after for Philly at 3, just with the athletic profile. Then you mentioned Charlotte as well. It feels like he'll probably go at 3 or 4, but anybody else could be on the table. And I really wanted to ask you specifically on Ace Bailey, just kind of early thoughts on him if you've dug into him a little bit, because it seems like everyone kind of agrees he probably has the biggest star upside outside of the top 2 guys in the draft. I maybe see him more of a super utility player. I'm not the biggest fan of Ace Bailey, but if you could convince me that he's got the work ethic to get to be a mold of a Michael Porter Jr. / defensive whiz hybrid, I think I could get behind that. But what are your thoughts on who the Jazz should, what their options should be at 5, and what they should be looking for in terms of another star upside bet, or just looking for someone that they could kind of plug into the rotation and see as a guy that they could build around and have a part of the core, whatever that looks like going forward?
Yeah, I think Ace Bailey matches a lot of what Danny Ainge has gone for traditionally, which is big with skill. Now he's not as big as I think a lot of people expected. His measurement at 6.5, 6'7.5", I should say, at the combine was maybe a little bit disappointing. So maybe he doesn't quite check that box as a safer pick, because if he's 6'9" and he shoots 35% from 3, those guys stick in the NBA, whether they become great at anything else or just kind of spot up shooters. And I thought he was going to be able to do that. At 6'7.5", it's a little more questionable, but I still think there's some safety there. I really do believe in his ability to hit shots, and I don't think he's going to be tasked with doing as much playmaking in the NBA in the right spots. Now, if the Jazz draft him, they're going to let him go for it. I think they would let Ace Bailey really try and become a star. I mean, they were hoping Cody Williams would show a little bit more of that than he did last year. And I talked to Cody late in the year and just said, like, what's this offseason about for you, before he ended up getting mono and really wasn't with the team for the last couple of weeks of the season. And he said, yeah, I'm trying to work on shot creation and creating stuff for myself. And I don't think that's something Cody is saying. I think that's something Cody's been told. And I would imagine they would try and get Ace Bailey a similar pathway, because I think Ace is a better prospect than Cody Williams was, certainly, and didn't hit shots at the same percentage that Cody did at Colorado, but certainly made a lot more of them. So I think that would be the goal with him. And that would be the trajectory. I still think he has a lot of value as a 6'9" guy in shoes, who I believe is going to have better defensive chops in the NBA than he did in college, and will be able to do some shooting.
Yeah, the handle is just always is the biggest thing for Ace right now. That he just, it's also he's a little bit like taller and all that kind of stuff. He just doesn't have a really tight handle at this point, and you saw a lot of those turnovers for him last year. And the biggest thing for me with Ace was he took a lot of tough shots, and he made a lot of tough shots, but it felt like that was the only kind of shots he was getting at times. But I do think in a system like Utah's, and under a really good young coach in Will Hardy, I think that'll be a chance for him to thrive. Before moving on to some other topics, I wanted to get your take on Tre Johnson and Kon Knueppel, because you mentioned those guys specifically. I know Jeremiah Fears has been mocked to the Jazz a couple times. That one doesn't make a ton of sense to me, with Isaiah Collier on the roster and Keontae George as well, still being a part of the at least immediate future. But Tre Johnson and Kon Knueppel, both guys that I really, really like. Tre Johnson in particular, I think he's got a lot of even higher upside than some people think. And Kon Knueppel, I think, is a lot more than what the archetype may suggest for him. I do think he's a guy that can put the ball on the floor. It can score, not just on catch and shoot spot up threes. Is there a guy between them that you like more, or just kind of what's your overall take on if those two guys are both available at 5?
I like them both quite a bit. I've watched both of them a lot this past week, because since the lottery, it's kind of seemed like those are the two most likely names for the Jazz. Tre, I think people are going to assume he has more star upside than Kon Knueppel has, because of, again, he's got some difficult shots that he was able to make, and he does. I think he shoots in tighter windows than Kon Knueppel does, and comes off of those screens and some of those dribble handoffs and just right up into his shot, which is what the best shooters do in the NBA. I do worry about his ability to get downhill. I know he's got like some fancy crossover moves. They don't get him anywhere. They're all east to west. They're not north and south at all. At least they're not north. Sometimes he gets to a step back, but it doesn't get him to the hoop. I think there's a real chance he's like a 39% field goal percentage shooter in the NBA, but shoots 38% from 3, which is like, it's tough. That's not really a star. There aren't stars that do that. You've got to be up in the mid 40s and then get to the high 30s as well, if that's going to be your archetype. And I think that's maybe a little bit safer, where I think Kon Knueppel's probably up around 43, 44, 45, because he is so crafty. And I know crafty can be a code word for white people, but I mean, really, he has great feet. He has an ability to get guys up in the air and then finish at the basket, even with some of his limitations offense or athletically. And then, I mean, he's just as good a shooter as Tre Johnson is. It's not maybe the difficult shot profile. I do wonder if you had flipped their roles, how differently would they look? Would Tre Johnson look a lot better playing on a stacked Duke team that actually runs a real offense versus whatever he was trying to do at Texas, which is why they
Don't
fired
get
the
me
coach.
started on that. Yeah.
Yeah, seconds after the season ended, if he even got to the end of the year. So Kon would look probably worse at Texas, and Tre might look better at Duke. I totally recognize that that's a possibility. I don't believe in Tre's defense at all. I think that's going to be a long shot. And, if you're a Jazz fan, you've spent since Donovan Mitchell was drafted in 2017, watching shooting guards from him to Keontae George want to play offense and never want to play any defense. And just what a hole that becomes for your roster. Kon is not a great defensive player. The physical tools, I don't think are ever going to lend him to be like an elite defensive player. He really tries on that end. I think his instincts are great. I think he moves his feet really well. I think he understands what the opposing defense is trying to do, and he knows how to get in the way of it, either on the ball or off the ball. So I think he's got more upside there. So I think as far as just like a building block, which, I just don't think you're getting a star at 5 in this draft, to be honest with you. I think you just keep building in the right direction and you take a step to move in the right direction. And if a year from now you are a bottom 5 team again in the NBA and you hope to be drafting one of those top 3 players that are, have star upside, if you have a Walker Kessler and a Kyle Filipowski and an Isaiah Collier and a Kon Knueppel, like 4 really good role players that fit around him, I think that makes sense. And you're happy you put in the work this year to get a guy like Kon Knueppel versus just repeatedly taking these upside swings. And I think Tre Johnson's going to be in the NBA a long time. I think, those shooters are valuable, but I look at maybe like the Malik Monk type that maybe needed a 3rd team or 4th team before they really fit in.
Now, before I get to the offseason stuff, I wanted to ask about 2 other guys, just because it still feels like the Jazz are in take the best player available mode. That's probably the wisest decision, regardless of where you are in the draft. But I know Kaman Malawach he's a guy I'm really high on, but doesn't really fit with Walker Kessler. Derek Queen's another big that could go in the top 10. Do either of those guys feel like guys that Utah would be interested in just from a best player available standpoint, or do you feel like those guys are probably not what fit the profile of what they're looking for?
I think the Jazz really liked what they got from Kyle Filipowski last year. And so the question is, do you think Derek Queen's a better version of that? Because if so, draft him, and then just have a bunch of versatility in the front court. And, Flip really surprised a lot of people with how well he shot the 3. I expected him to be a pretty good player. I was surprised he got to the 2nd round.
Yeah.
I thought the Jazz should have considered him with 29, which they ended up getting Isaiah Collier and then Kyle Filipowski at 32, which was really good work. And ended up being their 2 better draft picks over Cody last year. And, Cody was a very high upside swing. We'll see where he gets to. But, I think you look at if Derek Queen projects as a better player than Kyle Filipowski, you have a hell of a player. I think you have a starting power forward to go with, and actually a guy who will fit really well next to Walker Kessler. On the flip side, you look at the Mark Williams trade for the Lakers, and it was Dalton Connect, who's, he's not in vogue anymore, and certainly seems like he's available. But it was also a future first round. Was it a future first round pick, Dalton Connect, and is it anything else? I can't even remember what the other
I think there was a swap in there as well. There was a first round pick, a swap, and Connect. Yeah.
So it's like, if the Jazz could get, the understanding is the Jazz turned down that package at least, if not better, for Walker Kessler.
Yeah.
So if you were to get maybe a little bit better package there, or like, Austin Reeves is certainly, I think, would be the dream scenario for the Jazz. I don't know if you're getting Austin Reeves and a pick for Walker Kessler, though I think the Jazz would certainly ask for that. And then maybe you do take Kaman Malawach at 5 and just say, well, yeah, you replace Walker, you get a haul for him, you get a player who might have more offensive upside with his ability to potentially step out and shoot threes. At the very least, he can shoot free throws, which Walker has not shown he can do yet. If you thought that was the right pathway, and Malawach can be better than Walker, or at least the same, and you get 2 more picks for him, I think there's interest. It's an interesting development, but you'd have to have a lot of pieces in place to make that gamble.
Yeah, and that's a good transition to what I wanted to ask about next, with transitioning into the offseason and what the plans look like now that it is 5. The Jazz also have 21, 43, and 53 in this draft. So I wouldn't expect them to make all of those picks, just given the way the roster looks right now. There's a couple veterans that could or could not be on the roster next year. John Collins had a great season last year, his best in a couple years. But what do you think? How do you think maybe falling this far to 5 affects what the plan is, or if at all, with guys like John Collins, Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson as well? It just feels like the Jazz maybe have missed a window to move those guys, or maybe they just don't want to keep them in terms of having some veteran leadership in the locker room? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I don't think Jordan factors into anything as much as he's beloved and people like him. He's a good locker room guy. I don't, he's not in a place where he's going to help a team like the Jazz. He can probably find some spot minutes as a seventh guy, maybe a sixth guy on a good team in the NBA, but the Jazz don't need a good sixth guy right now. That doesn't matter to them at all. I actually think John and Colin might be at their highest trade value. In all honesty, they're going into the final years of their contracts. So not only do they have what were productive years last year, I mean, John Collins, there's a real argument he was the Jazz's best player last year. I only know he only played 40-ish games, 35-ish games, whatever it was. But
certainly was from a net rating standpoint. He was the only guy even close to neutral.
He shot the heck out of the ball. His defense was much better. I look at teams like the Golden State Warriors. I'm like, man, you could really use John Collins. You could use a big guy who gives you a little bit of size and some energy and some pop. And can step out and spread the floor. I think John Collins is a good player. And then on an expiring contract, he's a pretty low cost gamble for a lot of these teams. So, and on the flip side, the key doesn't factor into what the Jazz's future is. The problem, and I wrote this in a mailbag I just did, is it's the dazed and confused. It's I get older and they stay the same age. Like that's the problem with Lauri Markkanen and John Collins. Like they're a year older. So yeah. Lauri's going to be 28 and Lauri's going to be 29. And John's going to be 28. And, that's not ancient by any means, but the Jazz are bringing in another 19-year-old. So the Jazz continue to stay 20, 21 years old, and these guys are almost 30. It just doesn't really make sense. And if you had drafted Cooper Flagg, who plays like a 25-year-old, okay, that makes sense, but you didn't. You're not going to get that guy. You're getting a guy who isn't going to be good for 2 years, isn't going to be ready to help you win for 2 years. So what is Lauri Markkanen helping you for? Like, he's never going to evolve into this superstar that maybe you can build around. Like, I think the Jazz wanted to see if that was going to be the case over the last 2 years. It hasn't happened. So I think you move on from him. And then I think the same applies for John Collins. So as opposed to saddling those guys with, these somewhat made up injuries, exaggerating their injuries, or any nick or bruise, you just keep them on the bench. I think you move them. I think you go very young this year and you're still going to end up with, 25 or fewer wins. But at least the roster seems to have a core of timelines that make sense. They're falling a little bit into this multiple timeline dimension. And I think that's really a bad way to build a team.
Yeah, you answered my next question. I was going to ask about Lauri, and now I guess the question, the follow-up to that would be like, did the Jazz miss their window to move him last offseason before he got this big contract? How easy is it to move him? Obviously, he's still a very valuable player around the league, even if this past season wasn't up to the previous two for him in terms of efficiency and all that kind of stuff. Because like you said, the Jazz are not really in a rush here. Will Hardy is secure. Danny Ainge is secure. Like there's not a lot of, I'm sure there's urgency from those guys to win, but at least from an organizational overall plan, it feels like they're all on the same page in that regard. And maybe Lauri Markkanen doesn't fit with that anymore. Just, are there any kind of possible targets? Like what do you think the Jazz should be looking to get back for Lauri if they do make that decision to move on from him?
Yeah, I floated that you want to get talent back for Lauri. I don't think you want to just get draft picks, and that's kind of been the report around the Jazz. So I wonder if with the interesting thing about Lauri is, like you mentioned, a year ago he was the kind of the top player available. This year, probably depend on how teams look at it. Obviously, Giannis is going to be the number one player available. Kevin Durant's available. He makes $10 million more a year than Lauri does. He's going to want to sign another bigger contract that gives him more than $54 million or whatever he makes after this season starting.
Phoenix is also just limited with who they can trade with as well as a second apron team.
Right, exactly. I was trying to figure out, like, could you get him to Cleveland? It's like, no, you literally can't. Both of those teams are second apron teams. It's not possible. Yeah. So he actually is pretty difficult to move Kevin Durant. So I wonder if some of those teams that, like, if Milwaukee says, okay, Boston is out of the running next year for the championship because Jason Tatum's hurt, maybe we just run it back with Giannis and he doesn't become available. And Kevin Durant's hard to trade and he's 37 years old. Maybe Lauri just bounces right back up, and people are saying like, we wanted Giannis and we wanted Kevin Durant, but it didn't make sense. So we actually really like Lauri and we're actually not going to cost us as much as those guys do. So I think Lauri still has significant value, but I wonder if the Jazz try and buy low on a guy like Jalen Green, who, had a very miserable playoff series, but 18 months ago was the hot name because he had that 30-game stretch where everyone thought, the breakout's here, the star is here. And then can you even encourage the Rockets to throw in a Reed Shepherd, even if you have to give them another asset back? It's because I think those salaries match up nearly perfectly. It's like Reed Shepherd and Jalen Green for Lauri. Maybe the Jazz have to throw in a first or something like that. I don't think it would be the 5th overall pick. but they have so much draft capital. They could, go from something super valuable like their future Lakers pick they own or the future Suns pick they own all the way down to like a Timberwolves pick in 2027 that's going to be the 24th pick in the draft, or
Yeah.
even this year's 21st overall if you wanted to do something like that. So that's kind of what I would think. You get closer to the timeline, right? Jalen Green's still only 24 years old. I floated the idea of maybe you flip John Collins for Jonathan Kuminga in a sign and trade or something like that kind of rewards both teams for a little bit something. It's a gamble, but at least they're younger. You admit that those guys have a chance to be a part of your future, where I don't think Lauri or John Collins really do anymore.
Yeah, and just the Kuminga thing is really interesting for me because I mean he's a guy I've always liked, but Steve Kerr doesn't, so it's kind of made me think, why do I like him, kind of thing. But he would be interesting in the context in Utah, just with all that he's been able to show in the limited opportunities where it is kind of him letting him cook, kind of thing. And that would be an interesting buy low situation for Utah, where I think you could easily get out of that if it doesn't work out. I wanted to ask
he was in conversations last year. That was kind of the Brandon Pajemski, Jonathan Kuminga for Lauri Markkanen, and the Jazz.
Yeah, that was the big thing last summer. Yeah,
that's too rich. Like the Jazz think Lauri's better than that. I agree. I think Lauri is better than that. But okay, so maybe you go and you get a higher prospect draft player like a Reed Shepherd in a trade with Jalen Green if they want to just get off of his money and get a player who helps them in the half court. But maybe the Jazz actually did like Jonathan Kuminga and say, well, I think there's another way to get him.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I wanted to ask about like what the potential building blocks are going forward for the Jazz, who they are, who you think will be a part of the team in 3 years, 5 years, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, whoever they take at number 5 is going to be at this year. Walker Kessler could be as well. Kyle Filipowski, you mentioned, had a really, really promising rookie season, probably easily the Jazz's best rookie last season. Bryce Sensabaugh looked good at times. Isaiah Collier as well. And then there's always the Taylor Hendricks thing when he comes back. Like I was pretty high on him. Is that kind of the core you're looking at as the guys they're planning on building around? And then if anybody else pops, whether it is Cody Williams finally showing something after a pretty disastrous rookie season, or Keontae George maybe finally taking a step forward, does that feel like the group that they're looking to build around?
I'd probably go Walker 1 just because he's pretty safe, and worst case scenario, like you saw how good Luke Cornett was last night for the Celtics. Like worst case scenario, he's good. He's a good backup. And I think actually if he improves his free throw shooting, I don't know if the 3-point shot ever comes along, but if he shoots free throws a little bit better, he's going to be a legitimate, like all defensive candidate in the next couple of years once they have better players around it. But he's very good. And I think he's a very reliable finisher, and his improvement this year was pretty impressive. This has been, the big conversation is how would you rank the Jazz's young players? Bryce Sensabaugh made a really strong push late in the year and became an absolutely lights out shooter. And look, that's just the most important skill in the NBA. If you're not a star, just knock down shots and be solid. And he can do a little bit more with the ball in his hands, but he seemed to really commit to the idea that, hey, why don't I just be a 40+% 3-point shooter? And I think that has a lot of value. Taylor Hendricks is such a mystery coming back from this injury, but I agree with you. There was real excitement with the Jazz about his preseason and what he'd done in the offseason coming out of his shell, and his body looks insane right now. He's going to be really physically imposing, and I like his 3-point shooting as well. So I think those might be the top 3 guys, but Flip was great last year. I think Flip's going to be on one of the all rookie teams, or at least has a good chance to. And Isaiah Collier might as well. It's just the shooting might be a fatal flaw for him, where they're always looking to draft over him when they get the opportunity.
Yeah, before we wrap up here, I do want to ask about Cody Williams, just because he's a guy I know pretty well. I covered him for his lone year at Colorado. He's a great kid. I really enjoyed every conversation I had with him, even when I talked to him when he was in Denver earlier in the season. What do you make of his rookie season? Like I said, it really couldn't have gone much worse. Is there any optimism for you in terms of his development going forward? I think people need to get out of their heads that he's going to turn into his brother, because they were just very different prospects coming out as well. But what is the path for Cody Williams to becoming a rotation player in the NBA?
Yeah, I mean, I do like his defensive potential a lot. I actually thought he had some really good signs there throughout the season, a lot of deflections and just being in the right space. And he's very long,
Yeah.
When he first got on, kind of the people he talked to after his first kind of, summer practices, which the team's not involved in, but obviously they're aware of everything that's happening. And they said, like, he's really got it between the ears. They love like his ability to think the game and learn what they're asking him to do. And he does all that stuff right. They said when he took his shirt off, he looks like a 14-year-old, which is exactly right. I mean, he's just so skinny. He honestly might've been 185 pounds all year. and is probably the type of kid where he lost weight throughout the season. As much as like his shoulders may have gotten bigger, he just was probably never able to keep on any weight. So I think you honestly might have to give him even another 24 months to fix his body. Walker Kessler had such a good first year with the Jazz, went and played for Team USA in the FIBA tournament, came back his second season, was like, I just feel stronger and I'm more explosive. And then he had a horrible sophomore season.
Yeah.
And then year 3, it's like we finally saw the payoff of the work of his body. Like, it may not be till year 3 that Cody's body catches up to the work he puts into it and recognizes how to use it. And at that point, you judge him. And like, you know what? No one's going to be knocking down the door to get Cody Williams. Jazz are paying him a little bit of money because he was a lottery pick, but it's not like it's going to break the bank. So I think they can really afford to be patient with him. And I would put him in spots to succeed, see how much more he can develop. But I know they did really like him coming out of the draft, and I know the people around the Jazz like who he is. They like his character. I think they like his potential still. But yeah, had to be certainly a disappointing rookie season.
All right, before I get you out of here, Ben, just wanted to get your opinion on what the ideal offseason looks like for the Jazz. Who they take at 5, maybe if there's anybody you're eyeing at 21, kind of the late in the back half of the first round, or some second round guys you've dug into, and then what they get for a Lauri or a John Collins, or even if they move off Clarkson, Sexton, all those guys, what kind of the roster and building blocks look like after this summer, maybe say in August.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big one is Taylor Hendricks getting back healthy. Unfortunately, he's not going to be in the summer league. You're not going to see that at all. But I think an ideal offseason does bring in, a Ace Bailey or Kon Knueppel or Tre Johnson. Like at 5, you're hoping to get somebody that sticks. And I know everyone wants to think you're swinging for a star there, but like Dwayne Wade's not in this draft at 5. He's just not going to be there. So I think you hope to find a guy who, steps in and is just a better player than what you have on the roster now, and can maybe be the guy that, even if he's not a star, is your best prospect. And look, at 5, he should be. You drafted Taylor Hendricks at 10, you drafted Taylor Hendricks at 9, you drafted Cody Williams at 10. Like the 5th pick is a lot better than those, and was in a better draft. This is a pretty good draft, and you're getting a guy at 5. So I think you hope you get the player who you think has the highest upside, even if it's not an all-star upside, and a guy you can really build around. I think you've probably, if not rearranged the veterans on the team for younger players, you've gone into the season with the recognition that like them expiring and $60 million coming off the books between John Collins, Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, KJ Martin, certainly not a bad thing. But if you wait too long, it just gets hard to make big trades in season. It's getting harder and harder to do that. So you may want to move some of those guys before the season starts, just to know that you've kept those assets alive beyond this season. Because I don't know if the Jazz are going to, do any damage for anyone in free agency next summer. Certainly, there's not going to be a lot of interest in the Jazz. I think that's beneficial. At 21, I actually kind of like the draft quite a bit. Once you get to that point, I don't think the 40s matter at all. I think those are terrible draft picks and are going to be going forward with NIL and how many kids are going to go back to college instead of trying to get on a two-way contract in the NBA. But Kalkbrenner's there. Danny Wolf is there. There's the big setter who's doing a good job out of Stanford, the French kid.
Reynaud, Maxime Reynaud, yes.
Like he's very exciting. Like I could see the Jazz going and saying, like, why don't you take a swing on a guy who, if it hits, he could replace Walker Kessler. Not that you want to replace Walker, but like, what if? And then you can trade Walker for, this big haul for, whatever the Lakers want to give up to try and maximize whatever little window they have with Luka and LeBron together on the floor. So I can see them going something like that. Or, there's always a Yegor Demon. I don't think he's going to be on the board at 21, but there's a chance. And, 6'8.5" with some
Jazz fans certainly know who he is at this point. Yeah.
And no one will know him better than the Jazz. Danny Ainge and Ryan Smith will know him better than anybody. So they've seen him a lot. So I definitely could see a pathway like that. And I think the Jazz are still primed for a pretty good summer. And I won't be surprised if, after how difficult last year was for the fan base and how difficult falling in the draft was, if they felt like they needed to shake up the status quo just to kind of change the feeling around the franchise, change the aura around the team and the roster, just to kind of mold it into a little bit more of a recognizable shape, as opposed to just kind of all these scattered pieces that they have at the moment.
All right, Ben, I really appreciate you coming on in the aftermath of a disappointing lottery for the Jazz, but I do think it's going to be an exciting summer ahead with some shakeup coming. So if anything big happens, we'll reach back out and try to get you back on to break it down. This was a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, that'll do it from today's episode of Basketball in the Mountains. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or if you prefer to watch on YouTube, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. Great conversation with Ben talking about the Jazz. I will be back with Vinny Benedetto, my colleague at the Denver Gazette, as soon as the Nuggets season is over. Could be as early as tonight. It could be over by the time you're listening to this, and we'll get into that Nuggets post-mortem, unless they are able to pull off a stunning upset here and beat the Thunder twice and get to the West Conference Finals to face the very familiar Timberwolves. So a lot coming on this feed as May goes along. Going to get back into more college basketball stuff, I promise, as well. With the transfer portal kind of settled, really want to dive into the off seasons that these teams have had and hoping to get some really fun guests on. So appreciate everyone for listening. As always, like I said, go subscribe, rate, review. All that is super appreciated, and enjoy the weekend of basketball.